We're talking about time 2012 and the research being done by Glenn Kimball into both the what's written on the Mayan calendar, as it were, and what's between the lines. And Glenn, by the way, how are things going over at Kimball College, over at your website?
Well, it's so critical that people get a foundation about what happened in history, and that's what the Kimball College is all about. Is that we take off the gloves and we don't have an agenda. Well, probably the only agenda that we might have and people can accuse us of is that we are great believers in deity. One of the things that I marvel at is that Michio Kaku, who I have enormous respect for, talks about the three levels of civilization that might exist in the universe, one being the level of civilization that control the power of the earth, the other one that could control the power of the sun, the next level being a civilization that could control the energy of the galaxy. Well, he leaves conveniently off the one that said of a civilization that could control the power of the universe itself, which is, only to be understood. Michio Kaku also made the comment that in our day and age, it's a lot harder to believe in skepticism than it is to believe in a God. And I find that to be rather interesting, rather Einsteinish in nature. Einstein, when he set out to discover the nature of the universe, he had a model in his head of the universe being static. And when I mean by static, meaning that he would find that the universe is infinitely old, and that the systems of supernovas, etc., and the cosmology of the universe was something that was extremely old. When he found out that the universe was only 13.5 billion years old, it made him choke. I mean, he was completely astounded, because the fact that it's only 13.5 billion years old precludes the question of why did it begin then, and who was involved if there was one, and how can we see the organization, and one of the biggest questions that bothered him was, here the Earth is made up of heavy molecules. Iron, the most predominant molecule on the surface, on the crust of the Earth, is oxygen. People don't know that piece of trivia. But we have uranium and plutonium and lead and all kinds of very complex molecules. These molecules, scientists say, came out of a supernova explosion. Well, if we take our universe alone as being the average life of a star, this star, according to scientists, existed somewhat before the existence of the Earth, or let's say 500 million years before the Earth existed. So we've lived about 5 billion years into the life of the sun, and they predict from their very good measurement techniques that we have about 5 billion left before it goes to a super red planet and then into a supernova and becomes a white dwarf. So in other words, the life of our sun basically is 10 billion years old. Well, if the universe is only 13.5 billion years old, and it took half of that time to get the organization of the universe to look like it is, with galaxies and planets going around stars and those kind of things, there's not enough time in the universe to have created what we see both on the Earth and in the sky.
Now, Glenn, that's all very interesting. But just for the record, the question was, how are things going over at Kimball College?
Oh, well, Kimball College poses all these questions, and Kimball College is doing extremely well because, people who take a couple of the classes go completely berserk, and they go, holy cow, I got to get more of this. We're currently at 51 classes at Kimball College. You can download them or you can take them on hard CD. I recommend you take them on hard CD because people, you can share them with your friends, you can copy them, and those kinds of things. But we're at 51 classes along with the adjacent reading material, and the Kimball College. The important thing about the Kimball College is not that it's just another educational institution. This is the first time that anyone's taken the gloves off. The gloves in terms of what exists in terms of ancient manuscripts that are out there.
That's good. I need to know more, but I just got to get the break in. It was just so hang on a second, because it's the end of the world as we know it next, and you'll hear more about Kimball College, too, coming up on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Sometime around the year 2012, give or take time on either end of that date, the calendars of the ancients predict that there will be a major upheaval on the planet, that geologically, meteorologically, we're going to see so many major reversals of things that we've come to take for granted. For example, the flow of the ocean, or the space that our continents claim, or the shape of our coastlines. And it'll happen sometime around then, according to the Mayan calendar. Glenn Kimball's been talking about that. So Glenn, is there anything else in the Mayan tradition, in this book that you told us about, that the messenger showed you at the beginning of the show when you were telling us that story? Is there anything else that helps explain what 2012 will look like?
Well, 2012 will obliterate, according to the Mayan tradition, and according to Inca tradition, and, believe it or not, according to Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as was the predominant theme of Hesiod. Hesiod lived at the time of Homer. Hesiod was the one who chronicled the 5 epics of men, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Age of Lemuria, the Age of Atlantis, and our age. They talk about the very end of the earth as being an epoch of time where political entities will be erased, and there will only be one. And when there will only be one religion, for example, there will be one philosophy, there will be one predominantly agricultural entity that feeds the entire world rather than just feeding who can pay for it. Those kind of things. And that's really critical. We look toward the book of Genesis, and in the book of Genesis it says one of the things that God commanded Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and I know you have a question about that in the future here, but one of the things that God commanded Adam and Eve was to multiply and replenish the earth. How can you replenish something that didn't exist before? And then in Genesis
wouldn't it just be replenish what they were using? I mean, that is, you used something for shelter or used it for food, that was your obligation to help put back what you've used.
Yes, that's one particular philosophy, okay. But it also talks about the men of old and men of renown that were attracted to the daughters of Adam and Eve. Now, Adam and Eve are supposedly the first generation of time.
Right.
And suddenly they come in contact with these men of old and the men of renown. Who are those guys?
Right.
You know, Orson Hyde wrote a treatise in the 1800s. He's a great scientist and theologian. He said that there were as many people on the earth at the time of the coming of Adam and Eve as there were at the time of the flood of Noah. And Hesiod says the same thing. He talks about the civilizations of people that were here prior to Adam and Eve become relegated to being the patriarchs of the final epoch of time and not the first people on the earth. And that's where Western Christianity and the original religions of the earth would diverge or separate.
Mm-hmm.
Is that this was, you know, this religious fervor or this understanding or this body of knowledge was something that has been here for a very, very, very long period of time. We found the bones of people who are a lot older than the supposed date of the coming of Adam and Eve. And that's one of the problems for our children that are going to college. They find out that the oldest civilizations in the world come out of Chile, not out of Africa. They're mummies that are 100,000 years old. We can touch them, we can feel them, we can analyze them, we can take the DNA out of them, we can do whatever we want with them. These are people that literally existed here, and they were human beings with clothes, and obviously were civilized in some fashion, and that comes into direct conflict with their understanding of creationism.
Yeah.
And so our modern concepts of creationism, we don't read our own Bible. We don't understand our own. But
you made a reference to the fact that not just South American or Central American traditions are looking at the year 2012. But you said Judeo-Christian, and I am unaware of any particular date, any year that's being referenced in any of the apocalyptic literature of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Can you fill that in a little bit?
Well, at the highest levels of the Judeo-Christian, the Judaic calendar is the oldest known calendar still in operation in our day. The end of the Jewish calendar, you want to know what year that is?
Well, I didn't know that there was one. I thought the Jewish calendar was based just on the lunar monthly cycle. And by the way, anybody who happens to be Jewish, happy holidays coming up.
And happy holidays, I would recommend that too. But the Jewish calendar, if you go to the inner Kabbalah text, you'll find out that it ends in the year 2008.
I didn't know that. I really didn't know that. And it ends there meaning what? I mean, why would a lunar calendar end? Why would a lunar calendar not be as perpetual, say, as a solar calendar?
Well, that I can't answer you. I'd like to ask the question of all calendars, what business is it yours to end the calendar system under any circumstance?
Well, that's true. That's a fair point. But it seemed like with the Mayan calendar, since it was done, it appears as though, and you can describe it, but as I've seen it, it looked like, not Stonehenge is wrong, but it looked like it had a particular type of a design that seemed to reflect the Earth's movements, whereas most of our calendars today, they're just, whether it's a solar calendar or based on a simple system of the months, we don't concern ourselves with what year it's going to end. It's just we sort of keep looking at it as this is the date that will be on this particular shift of the moon and the sun.
Well, that's a brilliant comment, Ian, because calendars were never invented to just keep time. And calendars were invented not only to just chronicle growing cycles.
Right.
Calendars were used for a variety of different purposes, well beyond the growing seasons of the year and well beyond picking a date out. These calendars were intended to teach the cosmology of the universe. Were designed to teach the secrets of the initiates, and all kinds of information that are on the surface of these calendars. These calendars were an all-purpose magazine, so to speak.
Right. I think that's the interesting part of this. So I was just unaware that there would be any calendar in the Kabbalah that would say everything's over by the year 2008, or maybe not to even comment on it being over, just end it, as though that was not, significant.
Well, the Jews of our day, much like the Christians of our day, are slightly different, and in many cases very different than the Jews at the time of Herod or the time of Solomon. Pardon me, but their traditions were very different. They knew more then than we know now. Most of the Judaic practices we have in our day are much like Christian practices. They're shadows of what people knew in the past, rather than being comprehensive encyclopedias of what was known in the past. That's part of my rationale for when I said that when people say that in our day that our ancestors were stupid, and they everything they couldn't explain they blamed on the sun and called him God, that's really naive, because it really is super naive.
Right.
Our ancestors knew a great deal more than we give them credit for, and by the way, they knew more than us.
Well, they had to be more in touch with a simple astronomical phenomenon. They had to know what to expect, and they had to be. There was a greater connection between both, I think, their bodies and their souls and the earth.
Well, not only that, but in the gleaning of this information, so that they could have growing cycles and so they could interact with their environment very well, they found out that they could ask any kind of question. That's what Carlos Castaneda's learned from Don Juan Matus in his book, The Accu Way of Knowledge, which I happen to think is one of the greatest texts ever written, anthropologically speaking, a piece of nonfiction material, was required reading in my PhD work. He said that obviously that that he had learned from his ancestors, the secrets of all kinds. You could know anything you wanted to ask when you get into this realm. When you start asking about agriculture, you end up finding out about travel and lighting sources and medicine and all kinds of different things that are seemingly unrelated, but aren't unrelated at all.
Right. Well, so back to the actual cataclysm itself. The polarity of the Earth would shift. The ocean's currents would be redirected.
Which would affect all the climates entirely.
Right, and it would perhaps dislodge even the current agreement that we have between the continents and the tectonic plates, and that they would suddenly be adrift again, which would be devastating. And all of these things could happen over how long a period of time?
Over just a very, very, very short period of time. We're talking about between 1 and 7 years, which agrees typically with a biblical understanding of the end of the world.
Okay, and so when it's over, you mentioned sort of these planet killer volcanoes. At the end of that period, where these supervolcanoes happen, is it over? Is it lights out? Is it the end of the world as we know it?
Well, it wasn't the end of the world the last 4 times it happened. That's how we get the men of old and the men of renown. They were still remnants of a civilization that wasn't completely destroyed.
That's an interesting tie-in. So that maybe that's where the story of Genesis is an allegory for the recreation of the earth, not the creation.
That's correct.
Okay.
You're right. You smack dab hit it on the head, and I've been having a struggle trying to say it.
Okay, well, there you go then. And so the recreation, what we should be talking about is recreationism, according to what you're talking about, and that these men of old, they were the survivors of the last time the poles may have shifted and the world had to start again.
Well, that's true. We look at the great work of Zecharia Sitchin, and though he and I would probably be on opposite ends of much of the belief in the world, he talks about the Sumerian Anunnaki. Okay,
right.
If you actually look at the Anunnaki exhibit, the one that toured the Royal British Museum and the one that toured the Louvre, if you look at the statue that depicts the Anunnaki himself, the individual, the Anunnaki, what does it look like? You got to look at it carefully. It looks like a man nailed to a cross.
Didn't know this. I don't know. I can't even picture what you're talking about. Why would his hands be out to his side? You mean much in a sort of a crucifix pose, or is
Absolutely.
there some sort of device that he's tied to or anything?
He's nailed to a cross.
Okay.
Crucifixion was only invented at the time of Julius Caesar, and this Anunnaki character, this prophecy of this Anunnaki character that's been carried around in the Sumerian artifacts is the description of a guy to come that would be nailed to a cross. I'm sorry, these people from former epochs of time had the same understandings we do, in that they felt that the final epoch of time would be 1,000 years long, or a millennial era of time, where everything would be renewed again, where there would be total peace for 1,000 years, which has never existed except in former epochs of time. And
it's easy to have peace if everybody's scrambling for shelter and digging for leeks to eat. I mean, everyone's going to be too busy for war if this dire prediction is true.
Well, what if you got a little help from outside help in helping you grow food and to learn what to eat and how to eat it and how to, we know from the records of the first epoch of time under King Kronos, which is called the golden epoch of time, that they learned how to grow food without even having to plant or sow.
All right, well, hang on to that. We'll pick it up there, and then I do want to get back to that question about the Garden of Eden. Just curious what you all are talking about these days over at Kimball College next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. And talking with Glenn Kimball of Kimball College. You can link up to Glenn Kimball through the coasttocoastam.com website. Find out the latest that Glenn has been working on, the manuscripts that have been thought of as lost or little known or hard to find when you're not having to pay a huge fee to get it in some book of collections of other things. You can order a lot of that stuff just directly right through Glenn. Take a look online at coasttocoastam.com and follow the links to Kimball College, which right now exists only online. But I don't know. There was some talk about actually putting a building and getting it up and running and making it a real institution. And heck, if they put a football team together, they could probably beat Notre Dame. They could probably put a team together this year and beat Notre Dame before the end of the season. We'll talk about a subject which Glenn just hinted at a few minutes ago. I had let him know that I was interested in following up a little bit, not just on the end of the world as we know it, but also the story, the Genesis story of creation or recreation, as we were just talking about it, because there's a couple of documents I've been curious about, and I wonder whether Glenn has access to them next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Glenn Kimball's been talking about the year 2012 and the devastating implications of the end of the Mayan calendar. Glenn, before I give up entirely on that subject about how the Earth wobble could end in a polar shift, which would change everything that we understand about the Earth and may, in fact, wipe out a large percentage of the populations on every continent. Before we give up on that entirely, can I ask, did the Mayans predict massive loss of life? I mean, did they ever talk about it in terms of, did they have a vision, like almost a kind of astro projection into the now from where they were? Or was it just a mathematical thing for them?
They definitely did. They predicted the world populations would be dramatically reduced.
How do they describe it from their ancient perspective?
Well, they talked about it in a very apocalyptic sense, much the same way as the Book of Revelations did. They talk about the moon turning to blood. They talked about people dying of the fierce smoke in the air, and of regions of the world going into winter, and which had never experienced winter before. It talked about apocalyptic events out the years, and they talked about the fact that if we didn't change our behavior, that the power of goodness is enormously powerful. People don't understand that. We're just beginning to understand that. Science will eventually talk about that again after being quiet on that issue for a couple of thousand years. But they definitely talked about there being only a remnant of the people that survived this cataclysmic event.
All right. And as the Mayans saw it, I mean, is it's informed, through these contacts that you've made and through these books, did they see their resurgence coming after that? I mean, here you described earlier in the show these 6 tribes of Mayans who have been, connected contiguously now to the original Mayans for all of these centuries, but hidden underground in these caverns and just sort of waiting. Are they proposing that that's their time, that the Mayan Empire will return after the fall of the world as we know it?
Most certainly they are. The legends of Wakia, Wakara, Kukulkan, Tichiwitakocha, these kind of individuals were all the tales of the Pale Prophet. When he returned, he would bring back life, and he'd he'd take the people out of this cataclysmic age and give them back their civilizations and their life. This is so enormous. I've done a class on this particular one. It's called He Walked the Americas, which is L. Taylor Hanson's work. She taught at Southern Cal on the legends of all the way in 100 different Indian tribes from North America all the way into South America. they definitely felt like that they would be restored to their former honor. You have to remember that 50 million Native American Indians died when Pizarro brought measles and smallpox and things into the Amazon jungles. We have their remnants of their civilizations, which would have fed and housed 50 million Native American Indians, and this was bigger than any Holocaust ever mentioned in our day. Can you imagine that 800 soldiers came and cost the life of 50 million people?
Yeah.
It's enormous. The seriousness of what happened in the Americas, they knew it was coming because of the behavior of their own people, and they predicted that their people would come again when this great pale prophet who would come with a beard and come out of the east and would restore a peaceful life for 1,000 years. They spoke specifically of that.
Okay, very interesting. Well, since we're talking about the end of time, let me push you back to the beginning for just a minute, and let me ask you about research that you have done over the years on the Garden of Eden. It came up as part of this, but I know it's also sort of a tangent, so forgive me on this. But I was curious. I was sort of thinking of you in the last couple of weeks. Have you done much into any of the literature about the Garden of Eden that is not mainstream manuscript work? I mean, I know we've got, for example, we've talked about the Colburn Bible, and there's all these alternative, gospel texts for Christians and stuff. But what's out there on the Garden of Eden that's ancient?
Well, I've had this in my library for 45 years. You're asking me a subject I'm very familiar with. Remember that Christopher Columbus, when he sailed out as a ward of the Spanish government,
right?
He was looking for two different things when he sailed on the Nina Pinta and the Santa Maria.
Yeah, not many people know this. I think this is very interesting.
Yeah, he was looking not only for a way to Cathay, which his ancestors had done for millennia, getting rich off the riches of the Far East. And by the way, there's a story behind that too, if we get time to talk about it. But he also sailed looking for the source of the Garden of Eden, because nobody in their day and age thought the Garden of Eden was between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They had always been told that the Garden of Eden was in the west. Every single civilization, from China to India to Egypt to everybody, thought of the Western Hemisphere as being the place of the gods. I mean, when I went to Egypt, they talked about the land of the inverted sea being the land of the immortals. When you think about what is an inverted sea, an inverted sea is a sea that's upside down, or on the other side of the planet.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that.
Huh?
I hadn't thought of it like that.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what they were meaning. That the scarabs went down into the earth to go visit the land of the immortals. Well, so Christopher Columbus and Ponce de Leon was not so much looking for the Garden of Eden so he could pick some nice fruit. He was going there to pick to find the fountain that came out of the Garden of Eden that gave eternal life.
The tree of life.
Yeah, and where did he go for it? He didn't go to the Tigris and Euphrates looking for it. He came to the Americas. Well, they're not the only people. We have a book called The Lost Books of Eden, which is a broadened account of Adam and Eve. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It was originally, our copy of it that survives in our day was originally written in Aramaic and translated for us in our day and found on my website. You can get a copy of it.
I'd love to do that. I think that sounds very interesting. What's in it?
Well, what Adam and Eve did is they left the west gate of the Garden of Eden, not the east gate. The east gate of the Garden of Eden is between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. That's where the children of Adam and Eve migrated to. But the west gate of the Garden of Eden was someplace in the west, and when they left immediately out of the Garden of Eden, they went into a place called the Cave of the Treasures. That's enormously bizarre terminology, because when you talk about treasures, what kind of treasure are you talking about? You're talking about a treasure from a civilization that was before them. These caves, these labyrinths of living quarters were occupied by people that were already there and who had treasures. And it was a labyrinth of caves. That is not descriptive of something that's in the Middle East. It's descriptive of these cavern systems that's in the United States. I apologize, but that's the way it is. You know, one of the things that John Wesley Powell, who was who worked for the Smithsonian Institute, I have a lot of respect for him, but he did something really naughty. He was also the founder of the National Geographic magazine. He went out and was given the charge to establish the history of the Native American Indians. And what did he do? He sent out a barrage of people to deliberately destroy every single mound they could come in contact with, in addition to the artifacts within those mounds. In essence, he destroyed an entire generation of history of the Americas. And he installed into the minds of the people from the Smithsonian down that nobody was here or had been here in the Americas prior to the coming of Christopher Columbus, which is completely preposterous. The Toltec Empire was a great merchant society. They trafficked and sold merchandise in both directions. We know that, for example, the drug trade in Egypt in 2500 BC included cocaine and tobacco. We know that because we've done toxicology reports on the hair of mummies of Egypt, and 90% of them contain cocaine in their hair, and that's only grown in one place, and that's in the area of the Toltecs. We know that in China, that Shi Huang, who was the emperor in the 3rd century, sent an entire 3,000 of his best sons and daughters to go retrieve the secret of immortal life because they didn't have it. And where did they settle? They settled in the area where the Olmecs were, and the Olmec society at that moment ceased to be called Olmecs and began to be called the Toltec Society. And the Toltecs were doing trade all over the world. So, pardon me, John Wesley Powell, you were a naughty boy. And when I went to Egypt, one of the things that aggravated me worse was I went to all the sites where the exiled Jesus and his family, when he was a young child, where he went for those years when he was fleeing from Herod. Right. I went to all those sites, the 27 locations that they've identified where the family had gone. All of those have been bought up by one organization. Who was that?
The Vatican?
The National Geographic Society. And they had ropes around it. They wouldn't let you take pictures. They wouldn't let you talk about it. And they themselves don't talk about it. It's the same attitude. They wanted to recreate. I don't know how they got into the religion business. They should stay with the fauna and flora. They're a lot better with that. In fact, it made my visits to the dentist so much more pleasant.
No, I'll tell you why. Because there's money in it, and everybody knows it. If Time magazine puts Jesus or Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary on the cover, they get a spike in sales. And National Geographic Television knows that too, and they do a lot in the archaeology of the Middle East. Well,
I happen to love their magazine, and I actually respect John Wesley Powell. But there's a real problem here. There's an enormous problem with what has been licensed and what has not been licensed. As a matter of fact, one thing that they own and publish? They own and publish the Gospel of Judas.
The National Geographic does.
The National Geographic does.
Right. That doesn't surprise me.
And why do they own that? Why don't they own one of the thousands and thousands and thousands of other texts that exist in Egypt dealing with the Christian era of time? Why do they only publish that one? Because in their mind, it has a tendency to confront the traditions of Christianity. And pardon me, I don't know why they would own that and the Talmud Emmanuel, which is a similar manuscript, and why they would choose to publish just that.
Well, that's very interesting, but I want to push you back to the Garden of Eden thing. Are you familiar with, and have you ever had any access to literature about a guy named Prester John?
Absolutely. Prester John. You know who Prester John was? I did a whole CD on Prester John.
Did you really? I've never. So is this still something that you have available through the Kimball College?
Absolutely. It's called John the Beloved, the Undead Apostle.
The Undead Apostle. That's great. And it's about this guy who some people consider to be a king, but was left to oversee, left to protect the Garden of Eden?
Prester John, when the apostles met together and Jesus offered to give them the one wish of their heart, Peter stood up first and said, I want to go quickly back to heaven and sit on your right side. And Jesus said, well, the right side is something only my Father can grant you, but you're welcome. I'll take you back to heaven with me when you die. And all the rest of the apostles thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. I'd love to go to heaven. And they all followed suit except for one. And the very last one was Jesus' best friend, John the Beloved. And Jesus said, you don't even have to tell me what you want. He says, I already know the wish of your heart. In your heart, you want to tarry till I come again. And so, the teachings of John the Beloved Apostle, that you don't have the bones of John the Apostle in the chapel in the great monastery there in Ephesus where he was reportedly have died. The only thing they found was his shoes. But what you do find is all the way across the Himalayas, the Assyrian monks and all these people in Tibet, etc., have the teachings of a guy named John the Apostle or John the Priest. John, and he ends up living in China at the time of Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan. Now, pardon me, John is not a Chinese name. Okay?
Right.
It's just simply not. And the reason why he went there, and I'm going to make this real quick, is that in the Old Testament there was a prophet by the name of Eber. Eber is the namesake for all the Hebrew nation, or Eber or Hebrew, okay? He had two sons. One of them was Peleg. He went west during the time of the Tower of Babel. He became the patriarch of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that lineage over there. His other son, Joktan, went east to the greater populations, and the reason why there were greater populations in the east was because they were the ones that survived the cataclysm at the time of Atlantis. Pardon me, but that's I have another class on that one on my website. But so the Chinese, you can compare the actual written Chinese phonetic language with that of Hebrew, and there's a massive connection between the characters.
That's very interesting.
And John Prester was embedded right in the middle of it. You don't think Jesus would have left the people in China who were descendants from the Hebrew nation without some sort of contact after the crucifixion. He sent his missionaries there. And one that headed that was John Prester.
Well, and this thing about Prester John or John Prester was that he was as a king, was he not rumored to have an army that was going to come and help fight the Crusades with the invading Christians?
Actually, Genghis Khan offered an army to go fight the Crusades. And the reason why he offered an army to go fight the Crusades is because he learned from Prester John what was happening with the Templars. And the Templars turned him down. They were afraid that if Genghis Khan came over the mountain with his armies, that he might not go home. And I can't blame them.
Yeah, maybe not once if there were any riches there to be had.
Why would Genghis Khan offer to help the Templars in conquering the Temple Mount again if they didn't know what the Temple Mount was all about?
Where do you think people ought to look to find if there is any truth behind an actual geographic location for the Garden of Eden? Where should we be looking?
Well, we know that in some of the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings of Moses said that the Ark of the Covenant would finally come to rest at the feet of Mount Nebo, in the valley of the Red, White, and Blue Rivers, in the valley of the Blue Shroud. So we have to look for a mountain which supposedly is this Mount Nebo, in a valley with three rivers, and in a valley that's called the Valley of the Blue Shroud. Well, guess what? There is a mountain. It's coincidentally called Mount Nebo.
How about that?
It's in the valley of three rivers, the Red, White, and the Blue River.
So
and it used to be called the Valley of the Blue Shroud. And guess where that is?
Illinois.
It's in the Ark, Kansas, or the Ark Nation forest.
The Ark Nation in Arkansas. Well, good. We'll leave that one hanging out there. But I love always where you go with this. I never know exactly where Glenn Kimball's research is going to be taking him or us on Coast to Coast AM.